Yeah, one of the important qualities that the Buddha is teaching is non-violence. So not harming other beings. And the topic of non-violence is still very relevant today, unfortunately. Yeah, so something still widespread on larger scale or smaller scale. That I just checked briefly, and on average there are about 100 armed conflicts in the world, from larger wars to smaller violent clashes. And every year unimaginable amounts of money are spent on military. So the amount of money spent on military in all countries of the world is about $2.4 trillion. So and just for examples, the leading in militarization are the United States with about $1 trillion, and then followed by the NATO with $400 billion, and then China $300 billion, Russia $150 billion. Yeah, and this amount is not just spent once, but every year. So it's really like, difficult to imagine that if you think about what could you achieve for people if you would spend $1 trillion to actually help people or build infrastructure, things like that. And obviously, yes, $1 trillion is a million times $1 million. So obviously also some companies and people get incredibly rich by these wars and selling these weapons. And so apart from this sort of large-scale violence, there's also violence associated with crime or in media, violence in families, and so on. So it's very worthwhile to consider the teachings of the Buddha on non-violence and to practice it and commit to it, and so that we ourselves become more peaceful and also the world becomes a more peaceful place. The principles of the Buddha's teaching on non-violence, they are not very complicated. The Buddha was even teaching it to children. So 2 short examples in the Udana. And so one time in Savatthi, there are some young boys fishing, and then the Buddha sees them sort of catching fish, and then he spontaneously just talks with them. So the Buddha just asks them, do you fear pain? Do you dislike pain? And so the boys say, of course, yes, Venerable Sir, we fear pain and we dislike pain. And then the Buddha gives a short of inspired utterance, and so he says more or less, that if you fear pain, if you dislike pain, don't do any bad actions openly or in secret. If you have done bad actions or do them now, then they will not be able to escape pain, and they will not sort of be able to run away from it. And so the Buddha was teaching them about the consequences of their harmful actions, and pointing them to the fact that if we do afflictive actions, actions that harm other people or other beings, then as a result we will experience unpleasant consequences. And so, more or less the teaching that if you fear or dislike pain, then don't do any harmful actions to others, and otherwise, sort of, as a result, it will lead to painful consequences. So teaching them about action and result. And then the second short teaching that the Buddha gives to children, some boys close to Savatthi, they are beating a snake with sticks, and the Buddha sees them doing that, and then also gives them a short teaching. One who, while himself seeking happiness, oppresses with violence other beings who also desire happiness, will not attain happiness hereafter. One who, while himself seeking happiness, does not oppress with violence other beings who also desire happiness, will find happiness hereafter. Yeah, so the Buddha pointing these children to this fact that we ourselves seek happiness and don't want to get harmed. And other beings, they also seek happiness and don't want to get harmed. And so noticing how we feel, what we want, and then other beings just feel the same as we do. And so considering that and making this connection, then that one sort of abandons violence or has more sense of empathy. So these teachings on non-violence, they're actually not very complicated, but they are still actually difficult to understand for many people, especially if someone doesn't have much empathy developed or much kindness or compassion. It's actually not so easy to see that, even these sort of simple teachings. So, just an example with fishing, then sometimes we get some contractors, some companies coming here, and then so we were up there at the stupa, and this person saw Lake Manchester, and then he thought, sometimes I go fishing, and it's sort of relaxing and it's nice to do that. And so obviously it didn't occur to him that he was actually doing something cruel, that he was setting up a trap, more or less, and then killing another being. And so even though this person was sort of intelligent and it's actually not so easy to see, and it requires a different form of development than even people with a PhD can be quite cruel, actually, and not see this is also another being that also wants happiness, and just like myself. And so it's a different quality than having this empathy, noticing how sort of I feel about that and how does this other being feel. It's also quite rare that to find any teachings that are sort of committed to non-violence without exception, I noticed, and most people believe it is sort of justified in one case or another, and also psychological experiments and sort of human history shows that many people are actually willing to use violence if they are pressured by some authority figures or by circumstances to harm others or even to kill other people. And I would even say that on average human beings have a certain tendency to delight in violence. You can just think about countless movies and novels, computer games, and most of them, they actually contain violence. And it seems almost like sort of a story is too boring to watch or to read if there's no violence in it. And whether it's a sort of fantasy movie or science fiction movie, usually you have some epic battle in it, and sort of which is obviously violence. And so it's interesting to notice that I just reflected back for myself, because I also was watching movies just like any other person before, and then interesting, why does one actually like to watch that? It's sort of somehow one finds it exciting, and and so it's good not to take it for granted that it will just naturally be harmless and peaceful in every situation, but to deliberately develop our actions and speech and mind in this direction to becoming a non-violent person. The Buddha is also teaching in various discourses about the causes of violence. One of the more obvious causes is aversion, or even stronger hatred. But then, what are the causes of aversion? And one factor is perception. How do we see other beings? Do we see them as enemy or as another being who is just similar like myself? Just like the Buddha gave this teaching to his children that this other being, this snake or this fish, also is seeking happiness, and just like we ourselves. And so depending on how we look at other beings, then it can be conducive for being peaceful or for being violent. Also, the Buddha, in Pali it's called the Paticca Sanya, perception of resistance. That we want something to be in a certain way or have a certain goal, and then someone or something is obstructing that. So if someone is in the way of what we want to do or what we want to achieve. And then if it's less serious, then maybe we're just a little bit annoyed. But if it's more serious, then some people then use violence. Other cause for violence is clinging to views. And so probably you notice if we have a certain view and then someone has another view, then we feel challenged or even threatened by that. And so then if someone has a different view, then naturally we feel of this resistance coming up, or even aversion, and then also up to violence. And this can be generally with any views, but obviously the political views, let's say like two examples, let's say the French Revolution, and then they had this motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, so freedom, equality, and sort of all people are brothers. But then to achieve that goal, they sort of cut other people's head off. So it's obviously from the aim and the action, it doesn't really fit together, or it's quite a serious contradiction. But one can see that also for goals that sound very inspiring, or ideals that sound very inspiring, if one is willing to use violence for them, then it leads to the same problems. And actually, similar. Let's say communism was also an attempt to create a better society, a more just society. And so this is just two examples for what can happen if someone tries to use violence for sort of a good cause to make a better society, a better world. And then obviously opposing anyone who has a different view. And similar also religious views, of course. There are also countless examples for clinging to religious views where it leads to violence, and even between people of the same religion. And then also if violence is sort of justified by religions in some way, something good, then it's especially, I would say, especially dangerous, because then once someone has this view that sort of violence is justified by some divine authority, then it's very difficult to abandon that view. So yeah, generally the problem is not so much with views in general, but if, let's say, the Buddha said it's actually something good to have a view which is in accordance with the Dhamma, but then clings to it, and then it can lead to conflict. And so also this right view in the Noble Eightfold Path is not so much in the sense of I'm right and you're wrong, but in the sense of right in the sense of leading to liberation, and basically adopting views which lead to the cessation of desire, aversion, and delusion, adapting views which lead to the right development of the heart or mind. And the Buddha also points out that hatred can arise from love. Love in the sense of liking someone. And so probably also explains that yourself, let's say you have maybe a friend, and then someone criticizes your friend. And then naturally you feel opposed to this person who is criticizing a friend. Or even maybe more extreme, let's say someone would kill your children or your parents, then most people would actually hate that person, and because they harmed someone they liked. And so one can notice that this sort of liking someone, or seeing someone as dear, then naturally if someone does something that we don't like to that person, then we feel aversion towards that person. Another example would also be relationships or marriage. Then not people, they sort of love that person in the sense of liking them, but then also they can turn into actually enemies during a long divorce. during a long divorce. Then so this word love that we would use in English, in Pali there would actually be 3 different words used for that. And one is the Pali word kama, sense desire, so finding someone attractive. Then the second one would be pema, something like affection or liking someone. So that can be, for example, between mother or children, and siblings or friends can also be non-central. And then metta, something like loving kindness or friendliness, that it's not directed to all beings. And that generally this quality of metta and karma, so sensuality and loving kindness, they're actually opposed, more like fire and water. And so while sensuality is one of the 5 hindrances which obstructs samadhi and seeing things as they really are, metta is actually a meditation topic that can be used to develop samadhi and used to develop the 7 enlightenment factors. So they are quite opposite. Then also desire can be a cause of conflict and violence. So let's say wanting power, wanting resources, or wanting possessions. And so in one sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 82, a king comes to ask a monk, Venerable Rattapala, and Venerable Rattapala gives the king some short teachings, and one of them is, the world is insufficient, insatiable, and enslaved by craving. And so the king is not sure what that means, and so he asks him, what do you mean by that, the world is insufficient and insatiable and enslaved by craving. And then when Ratapala explains to the king, imagine some reliable messenger would come from the east, and he would tell you, in the east there is a large prosperous country with lots of resources and wealth, and you could conquer it. Would you conquer it? And the king says, yeah, of course I would conquer it. And then same from the north, from the west, from the south, some messengers come and tell the king, if Your Majesty, there is countries surrounding you and they are prosperous and wealthy and you could conquer them. Would you conquer them? He says, yes, I would conquer them. So he's immediately enthusiastic. And then he says, and if someone would come across the ocean and tell you there's a country you could conquer, would you also conquer it? And he says, yeah, I would also conquer it. And then Ratapala says, yeah, with regard to this, the Buddha said the world is insufficient, insatiable, and enslaved by craving. So yeah, one can see, I mean, this is just a largest of scale of, then you can see that actually also this ambition or craving leads to, let's say, violence and oppression. And so when Ratapala is talking about a king who wants to rule over a country across the ocean. And so today we have a special word for that. We call it a colonial power. And so let's say the king of Britain didn't have enough to just rule over the island of Britain, but he also wanted to rule over, let's say, India and Sri Lanka and Myanmar and South Africa and Australia and New Zealand, because he was enslaved by craving. So another example, the king of Spain, and he didn't have enough to just rule over Spain, but he also wanted to rule over Central America and South America because he was enslaved by craving. So yeah, this is more like severe examples how desire can lead to massive violence, and in this case the death of millions of people and of great harm and damage to other countries. So the king takes the teaching of Venerable Ratapala quite well. He is not offended by it, surprisingly. So he really sort of, Venerable Ratapala pointed to his direct experience, and the king says, it's amazing, it's wonderful how true that is, what the Buddha said. It's actually true, the world is insufficient and enslaved by craving. This is actually how it really is. So he even sort of makes this connection and sees that in his own experience that, yeah, it's actually true. And so there are obviously also other examples that there are sort of limited resources, limited wealth, limited possessions, limited positions of power, and then, yeah, someone who wants these will compete with others who want them as well. It's sort of natural that it leads to some conflict or then even violence. Yeah, violence can also be caused by fear. So people see other nations or religions or races as a threat. And naturally, if people feel so threatened, afraid, then they're more protective, looking for their own advantage or for their own safety somehow, and then respond with to this threat, or perceived threat, with violence or aversion. And last, also delusion. Yeah, so usually people who use violence, they don't see the harmful consequences of their actions for others and for themselves, and in this life and the future lives. And so if people could actually directly see the harmful effects of their actions, the karmic results, and also the harm in the present life, then they would actually not do that. So one can see it's actually not so easy to abandon these qualities that give rise to violence or harming other beings. they're quite deeply rooted. And but the Buddha offers this teaching and training practice to abandon violence and the causes of violence from one's heart. And so first more the coarser ones and the more subtle ones. And so first, if we have abandoned the more coarser forms of harming others, then we become more sort of peaceful or clear and can work on abandoning causes of violence on a more deep level or more subtle level. So one important basic quality for developing non-violence is empathy. Just like I mentioned with this short teaching of the Buddha to these children, that's noticing how does it feel when I get harmed, and then realizing, reflecting other beings just feel the same like myself if they get harmed. And whether it's with, say, killing or harming or taking possessions or sexual misconduct. And so the Buddha says in this short Dhammapada verse, all tremble at violence, all fear death. Comparing yourself with others, one should neither kill nor cause others to kill. All tremble at violence, life is dear to all. Comparing yourself with others, one should neither kill nor get others to kill. So developing this quality of empathy. Then also changing one's perception about beings. As I mentioned, we rather than usually our way of looking at beings, we have all these different sort of attractions and aversions towards different people, and then replacing that with one attitude towards all beings, more and more. That's just like in this verse, that the one who himself seeks happiness oppresses with violence others who also desire happiness, will not attain happiness hereafter. So noticing that these whatever other beings there are, they are also looking for happiness and try to avoid suffering, and then looking at beings more from this perspective, rather than whatever, he didn't do that, or why is he like this, or this is sort of or as enemy or as obstruction. Another useful thing for developing non-violence is what kind of views we have. So, developing this view that any intentional killing or taking what is not given, or sexual misconduct or violence are leading away from liberation, and then having this intention to abandon them completely and to train oneself according to that view. And the Buddha calls this developing virtue a training. So you can get more and more skilled in telling convincing lies, or whatever, making cynical comments, or whatever, talking harsh, or things like that. Or on the other hand, you can get more and more skilled in speaking the truth, or talking in a way which is kind, or uniting people. And so this is a training, and so we adopt this view, what is not right speech and wrong speech, and what is right action and wrong action, and then we train yourself according to that view. And so then that we become more or less committed to non-violence in all situations, and get more and more skillful in mastering any difficult situations without the use of violence and without harming others. So when my mother was still a teenager, at that time in Switzerland there was a compulsory military service for any male citizen who became 18 or 20 would have to join the military service usually, and there was no choice or anything at that time. And so at the time my mother was just a teenager going to high school, and one of the teachers there at school, he refused to join the army and go to the military service. And so every year the police would come to his house or flat, and so he would have to stay in prison for a few weeks every year because he refused to become a soldier and join the military and learn how to kill. And so it's good to develop this attitude that one is unwilling to kill others or even learn how to do that, and to be committed to non-violence. And the Buddha says that losing one's own wealth or one's relatives means very little compared to losing one's virtue, for example. So he really takes that as very important. And also beyond this life, let's say, breaking the precepts is the cause for rebirth in lower realms. And so if one wants to escape the lower realms completely and realize dream entry, then one has to abandon these actions completely, because if one has this view of sometimes one just has to use violence, or sometimes one can't keep these precepts, then naturally the path to the lower realms remains open, naturally. And so, because of that, also diligence or heedfulness is very helpful for being non-violent. So, diligence in the sense that you realize that your actions have consequences, and so you're depending on what actions you do, it will make a difference between your long-term happiness or suffering. And as a result, you will be careful to avoid unwholesome actions, because it'll reflect that this actually leads to your harm, and then having this of heedfulness and being careful about one's actions. Beyond this more like coarse forms of harming other beings, one can also develop speech that is not harming others. So friendly speech instead of harsh speech, or uniting speech rather than divisive speech, or purposeful speech rather than useless speech. But the right speech would be our own topic, and one time I even gave some Dhamma talk about different occasions where the Buddha is challenged by people who either they want to refuse his teaching, they want to refute his teaching, or they are just aggressive and abuse him. And so there are various occasions where the Buddha also meets people who are actually aggressive or unfriendly and have different views, and then how does the Buddha relate to them? So one could make a whole ontology even on the topic. Another quality that's helpful to develop non-violence is something like endurance or patience. And so, for example, if people say something that we don't like, can we endure that without sort of retaliating immediately, sort of reflecting what can I say that is useful or helpful in the situation. And at the end, they say what people say is just sort of a sound, and we then often get upset about it for a very long time. And the Buddha gives this sort of simile of a line etched in stone or a line etched into the ground and a line etched into water. And so depending how long does this impact last from maybe speech or something doing something to you, and then how long you are resentful about that. And the Buddha even sort of, challenges the monks, and similarly, similarly, a monk can be very gentle, very peaceful, as long as people don't talk unfriendly towards him. But then when other people talk unfriendly towards him, then it can be known whether it's really kind and gentle and peaceful. So then you can actually see it, where before it's difficult to say. You just don't know whether his tendency is still there or not. And then also developing right intention, described like this: may these beings be free from enmity, affliction, and anxiety. May they live happily. Versus this intention of ill will or cruelty. So developing this intentions of friendliness, metta, or compassion. And already, if one just develops, let's say, friendliness or goodwill, kindness towards one person, that's already very helpful, and some form of punya. But then if one develops it immeasurably, then it's also has a much larger effect on the mind. And so you could say our heart has limitations, and in the sense that in some situations or with some people we can be friendly and kind, but then in some other situations and with other people we get irritated or unfriendly, or it's difficult. And the same with ourselves. Sometimes we can be friendly and kind towards ourselves, and sometimes maybe we feel sort of aversion towards ourselves, or sort of not really happy about how we are or what we do. And so, these qualities of loving kindness or compassion, they also change how you relate to yourself and how you think about yourself, how you feel about yourself, and then also how you perceive yourself. And the Buddha says desire, aversion, and delusion are limitation makers. They limit our heart or make it narrow. And then if we develop loving kindness or compassion, then basically we practice to overcome these limitations. And of developing, you could say, the great heart, the Mahagatang Chittang. And so gradually, if we do that, then our heart is less limited, but has this quality of loving kindness or compassion as a more of limitless quality. And obviously one can develop it in meditation, in a systematic way, but also just in general contact with people. And so the idea is that by developing loving kindness, compassion, and developing virtue, then we gradually sort of change our character and become a different being. So one of the benefits the Buddha says from developing loving kindness, metta, is that one develops samadhi quickly. So the citta, the heart, the mind unifies quickly. And my understanding would be that the reason is that if one develops loving kindness, compassion as immeasurable quality, there is then, at least to what extent one has developed it, then only this one quality in the mind. And so it sort of removes any other qualities that are there. And so if there's only this one quality and this citta, that the heart, the mind unifies based on that, then that leads to more samadhi. Yeah, people who use violence, they rely usually on sort of external strength and power, but usually the mind is actually not strong, and naturally these defilements, they actually are what makes the mind weak. And so by practicing the teaching of the Buddha, more or less that's also one perspective that the Buddha gives, that one can develop this other form of strength or power which comes from the mind, the power of the heart or mind. So there's this different sort of inner strength that doesn't rely on weapons or violence or being sort of intimidating or domineering. And so often people associate loving kindness or compassion with something sort of soft or weak, but yeah, that can also be, well, it actually is something different, so that if one develops it, then if it becomes a more like immeasurable quality, then that is actually something very stable and powerful. So yeah, that the mind becomes like the earth, which doesn't, can't be sort of disturbed much, and so overcoming this tendency of aversion can be difficult and takes time naturally, but on the other hand, if you practice becoming a more peaceful person, non-violent person, then if you have at least some loving kindness, compassion, is actually something pleasant. And the Buddha says the causes of suffering are actually our own unwholesome tendencies in our own heart or mind. And so generally, at least over long term, then we should notice some difference. That's actually we experience some more peace or less suffering because of that. And just like some people delight in harming others, so too the Buddha says one can also delight in non-violence. And so there are also some Dhammapada verses about it. And so that one actually, it's actually pleasant to live free from hostility or free from aversion. And so the Buddha says, happily indeed we live, friendly among those who are hostile. Amidst hostile people, made well free from hatred. And those disciples of Gautama ever awaken happily, whose minds by day and night delight in the practice of non-violence. So it's actually something uplifting and nice to be peaceful and have this quality of kindness or compassion. And the Buddha also describes this quality of the blameless happiness. So we feel actually a sense of peace or happiness because we don't harm other beings. And have not done anything unwholesome. And the Buddha also says that by developing non-violence, then you can give immeasurable number of beings freedom from fear, enmity and affliction. So naturally, if you abandon violence towards any being, then you give this immeasurable safety to all beings as a result. And as a result, he says also that we will enjoy immeasurable freedom from fear, enmity, and affliction. And on the one hand, obviously having less conflicts in this life, but then on the other hand, also as a result of our karma, then the larger picture of samsara, the reason why we get reborn in a world with conflict was that we have some mixed bright and dark karma in the past. And so, as human beings, we usually have some tendency to violence or harming others, because otherwise we would have been reborn as devas. And so the only way to get out of a world of violence is to more or less become completely non-violent and to abandon this tendency for violence completely. And then as a result, if there's no tendency in the mind or heart for violence, then naturally the result will be that in terms of rebirth, that one appears in levels of existence where this phenomenon doesn't exist anymore. And so the Buddha encourages us, and he says we should practice like this. Others will be cruel, we shall be not cruel here. Effacement should be practiced in this way. And others will kill living beings, we shall abstain from killing living beings here. Effacement should be practiced like this. And others will speak maliciously and harsh, and we will abandon malicious and harsh speech. Effacement should be practiced like this. And others will have ill will, we shall be without ill will here. Others will have wrong intention, we will have right intention. Others will be angry and resentful, we shall not be angry and resentful here. In this way, effacement should be practiced. And he says, even the inclination of the mind towards wholesome states is of great benefit. So what should be said of bodily and verbal acts conforming to that state of mind? So the mind should be inclined thus. Others will be cruel, we shall not be cruel here. And the mind should be inclined thus. Others will kill living beings, we shall abstain from killing living beings. And the mind should be inclined thus. Others will speak maliciously or harsh, we will abstain from that. And others will have ill will, we shall be without ill will. And so already even inclining the mind towards that is already helpful. And just as if there would be an uneven path and an even path by which one can avoid it, or an uneven ford and then another even ford to avoid it, so too a person given to cruelty can avoid it by non-cruelty. And a person who is used to killing living beings can abstain from killing living beings to avoid it, and so on. And a person who has ill will can avoid it by abstaining from ill will or developing a mind free from ill will. And just like all unwholesome states lead downwards, and all wholesome states lead upwards, so too a person given to cruelty has non-cruelty to lead him upwards. And a person given to killing living beings is abstaining from living beings that leads him upwards. And then at the end he says, even a person given to cruelty can extinguish it by non-cruelty. And a person is used to killing living beings can extinguish it by abstaining from killing living beings. A person who is used to speaking maliciously and harsh can extinguish it by abstaining from malicious and harsh speech. A person who has ill will can extinguish it by abandoning ill will. A person who has wrong intention can extinguish it by right intention. And a person who is angry and resentful can extinguish it by abandoning anger and resentment. And so then he is an encouraging end of the sutta. He says, in this way, the way of effacement has been taught by me. The way of inclining the mind has been taught by me. The way of avoidance has been taught by me. The way leading upwards has been taught by me. And the way of extinguishing has been taught by me. Whatever should be done for his disciples out of compassion by a teacher who seeks their welfare and has compassion for them, that I have done for you. Here are roots of trees, here empty huts. Meditate, don't delay, or else you will regret it later. This is my instruction for you. So the Buddha pointing out, he has actually taught the way of practice, that you can avoid the unwholesome things by the wholesome things, and you can develop the way upwards, and you can extinguish what is unwholesome and transcend it. And so, it's a nice perspective, and we can do that for our own benefit and the benefit of all beings. Any comments, questions? Yes.
Modern psychology says there's like mirror neurons now that if someone's angry at you, you automatically get anger back. But I don't know, even in the animal kingdom, obviously it's self-preservation. Can you get to a state where you can get even before that reaction, or will you always have, as if we practice enough, will we be able to break that link between self-preservation?
I think the tendency of an average person is to react to aversion with aversion, or react to being threatened by sort of resisting and so on. But the Buddha definitely says that it is possible to completely abandon this tendency. It obviously is not easy, but in terms of, let's say, retaliating or harsh speech or these kind of things, it is probably more easy to achieve in terms of even the mind state of resistance or any form of aversion. That takes quite already a high level of development, so then only, let's say, a non-returner would be completely free from this tendency. Let's say a stream enterer would have at least abandoned any sort of inclination, any tendencies that would, unwholesome tendencies that would lead him to actions that would lead to rebirth in lower realms. But in general, the Buddha says that this is actually possible, and if you develop, for example, loving kindness or compassion and practice to abandon aversion, then the Buddha also says that, can you notice, let's say, how does the unarisen aversion arise, and how can it be abandoned? How can you practice that it doesn't arise anymore? And then, more or less, by actually practicing and developing the mind like this, you gain a more and more profound understanding how your mind works. That's at least the idea. And then up to the point, if you have completely understood that, in terms of actually practical application, this is not sort of an understanding that you can sort of read in a book or something like that, but you have to understand that by actually trying to develop your mind, then ultimately, if you have completely understood this causality, then this tendency will be abandoned and it will not arise anymore. So the Buddha says there are also basically there are irreversible processes in nature. So if you burn a piece of wood, it turns into ashes. It will not sort of jump back into the state of being a piece of wood again. And so similar, the Buddha discovered by his awakening there are also irreversible processes in the mind. So then once certain tendencies are cut off, then it will not re-originate anymore. So this is definitely something that the Buddha says is possible. Obviously it's not easy, and it requires training the mind and sort of investigating the mind, but it is possible. It's at least what he says. Obviously before we have realized one of the stages of awakening, we don't really know. We have not directly experienced that this is something possible. But yeah, if you think about it, then maybe you notice sometimes, let's say, this tendency to aversion is stronger or weaker. Then, so you can sort of infer maybe there's a way of practice that this tendency of aversion does never arise anymore. It's sort of just a conditioned phenomena. So at least by inference one can sort of reflect like this. Yeah, this looks like that could be possible, even if one hasn't experienced that oneself, that some of these taints or the underlying tendencies or fetters are irreversibly destroyed. Yes?
Is it a matter of like recognizing the small instances of aversion that aren't too overwhelming and sort of chipping away at those, developing positive states of mind, and then kind of snowballing that, as opposed to like situations where one might not have as much control over the ability to recognize the beginning of the aversion and get overwhelmed by it and almost not have an ability to react. Sort of, is that kind of the approach to sort of build?
Yes, that's how I would describe it quite similarly. The Buddha talks often about basically practicing for the non-arising of unwholesome states that have not arisen, or for the abandoning of unwholesome states that have arisen. And so more or less the idea is that maybe if you start to practice meditation or start to follow the teaching of the Buddha, then maybe you're not so quick to recognize when an intention to kill another being arises, or an intention to harm another being, or when aversion comes up. And then gradually you actually notice more quickly and abandon it more quickly. And so basically the idea is that you already notice, even if there's a little bit of sort of irritation or aversion, that already then you can abandon it quickly. And then it will never grow into like a huge whatever story or conflict and so on. And that's applies the same for any other unwholesome quality, whether it's sense desire or restlessness as well. So ideally just naturally, first one notices more this, of course, forms of aversion or restlessness and so on, and one is more of having to deal with that, because that's how the mind is, just depending on whatever level of unwholesome states are there. But then afterwards, obviously one can maybe notice more subtle forms of aversion, sense desire, of disturbance of the mind, and then already practice at an early stage to abandon them, and then at an earlier stage. And this is part then of understanding this causality of the mind. How does that quality originate and get stronger? And by that you gain this knowledge that I described, how actually the mind works and how does this defilements of come up and get stronger, and how can it be abandoned. And that would be my approach. And then even basically already preemptive, one can already incline the mind so that it doesn't even arise anymore over longer periods of time. And that's something like that.
And I put your description of the line in the water versus the line in the stone. I thought it was so helpful. What was the middle one? You described
in the ground, just in the earth. So more or less that the line in the stone stays for a long time, then the one in the earth it gets sort of washed away by the rain or whatever, relatively quickly in a few months, something like that, and then in the water it just stays very briefly, disappears very quickly. And so depending on how long we have some resentment or aversion, it's this comparison of, obviously one can have some resentment or feel some aversion towards someone for the rest of one's life or for a few days or whatever. So I think that's it's a nice simile that one can remember. That obviously sometimes it's good to also avoid a person who has harmed you and actually not having contact with that person, but then at least not having a sense of ill will or aversion towards that person, but still having a sense of kindness but actually avoiding that person or not having contact with that person. So it's not that one of the Buddha also recommends, for example, not to associate with people with sort of unwholesome tendencies, if it's possible, but then also not to have aversion against them, but to actually have sense of friendliness or compassion towards them.
That's very, it's so subtle when I think about it, not to have any kind of aversion to say someone who's cruel but actually that also is not a good thing. And, but it's a very subtle kind of change in your character. How you can improve.
Yes, I think they're just noticing that's obviously, it doesn't help the other person if you have aversion towards that person, whatever things this other person has done, it doesn't help you or the other person to improve the situation. So it actually makes me more entangled and actually inclined to do bad things as well. And well, if you are free from aversion, you can at least think how can you improve the situation, or what can you do to help yourself or others or this person, if it's possible. Well, otherwise it's sort of it's difficult then, and naturally you just want to harm this other person, but actually there's nothing accomplished by it. And but it's also a very common tendency, also even in, let's say, in ancient times, in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, then it was considered a good thing to kill a evil ruler, for example. And so they already, if you read whatever about Caesar and Brutus or things like that, so they already had this idea, this concept that you sort of, to save the republic, you kill this evil person and then sort of save the republic, but then it didn't get saved as well. So at the end, and more or less, that since the beginning of humankind, people have tried to kill this of evil people, but still there is kind of people around, and so the problem is obviously that if you kill others, then you become one of these evil people as well at the end. So the more you're willing to use violence, the more become similar to them and then harm others and yourself. Yes.
Does the Buddha say anything about wars as well?
Mm-hmm.
Because, like we can say, at this stage, like Russian President Putin raided up all these people and went and raped, tortures, kills, murders, does everything to another nation, Ukrainians, for example. Has he said anything about how, like, a nation should approach in these kind of situations? Because obviously Ukrainians are protecting their homeland, they're protecting their own kids, their families. Is there something what they could have done, or is there any, or same as with any war, or a matter of fact?
There are a few instances where there were also wars during the time of the Buddha. So let's say one time King Ajatasattu, the king of Magadha, so he was quite ambitious and also wanted to expand his territory. And so one time he's attacking the kingdom of Kosala. And so there are these two kings that are fighting, and so the Buddha gets reported this story, and I can even probably approximately I could remember the verse, but more or less he says that victory gives rise to hostility, and the person who is the one who is defeated lies in suffering happily. The person who is peaceful lives happily, having abandoned victory and defeat. So he doesn't sort of he doesn't get involved in terms of this one is sort of the better one or the worse one, or so at least it is from my perspective. If I would be living in a country where some war comes, then I would obviously try to escape from the country if that's possible. If that's not possible, then would try to avoid joining the military or being involved in any military actions by either side. But obviously also, sort of refusing to, for example, join the military of any side or doing any acts of hostility or harming. Not even, if during the time of Nazi Germany, then people they would get executed if they didn't join the army. And so I think my recommendation, and as I understand the recommendation of the Buddha, would be to basically completely stay non-violent, either to whatever side, whoever is sort of the evil guy or the good guy, or supposedly, or so it is for the individual. That would be my recommendation, that one is committed to non-violence, and either obviously one can try to help people in whatever way one is able to, if one is living in this area, or but otherwise not to sort of try to help with violence or military actions. That would be my take on it. And as I said, basically that one develops this inclination towards non-violence, and this is more or less the only way to get out of a world which has some violence in the long run. And while one continues with acting with violence, then naturally this inclination continues, and in terms of the long-term perspective of samsara, then one will stay in some realms where there's violence. So also in terms of being, let's say, a politician or a ruler, it's actually a position where you can get into big sort of trouble, or to say. So naturally, I also with, let's say, kings at the time of the Buddha, then you can actually do a lot of harm if you're a king, or a ruler. And from that perspective, I would rather sort of recommend not to get involved in it. And also, let's say, if you're a scientist or maybe IT person or whatever administrative person, then not to work for the military in any way would be also my recommendation. So let's say that there are lots of scientists. I think a quite major number of scientists, like physics, whatever, engineers, are working for the military. And similar, let's say, IT, obviously they have also lots of IT or administrative things. And sort of my recommendation would be basically whatever kind of country it is, whether it's sort of they're supposedly heroes who help to liberate the world, or the evil guys, or the whatever whatever one thinks who these are. And so obviously say Russia will have some storyline with evil, and Ukraine and the United States will have some other storyline to actually not participate in that. And so also with other jobs associated with the military, then my recommendation would be to stay out of that as well. And even if during peaceful times, let's say you never know, you become maybe whatever, an engineer in the armed forces of Australia, or some administrator, or some IT experts working for the Australian Defence Force, and then whatever, to develop a missile or some computer programs that are necessary for operating them, and obviously whatever unwholesome actions get done with that, so if you sort of participate in it. So that would be my recommendation.
If I may, there was a
Mhm.
story I listened
Mhm.
to. There was one meditation teacher,
Mhm.
American one.
Mhm.
He was attacked on the street,
Mhm.
and one guy wanted to take
Mhm.
something off him or wanted to fight him,
Mhm.
and he just fell on his knees and
Mhm.
said, "I'm sorry, don't hurt me. I don't want to do anything. Take whatever you want."
Mhm.
And then this robber looked at him with disgust and said, you just go. But he actually would have known how to fight,
Mhm.
but he didn't because he wanted to be
Mhm.
follow the Buddha's teaching.
Mhm.
So I think it was very kind of funny that he really felt that he did feel like he would like to fight because he's a man and he can do it.
Yeah.
But in order to keep his precepts,
Mhm.
he was able to suppress these kind of urges and like to be the real man,
Mhm.
and then follow their teaching,
Mhm.
and then put his what do you say, this like whatever down,
Mhm.
and then he was able to, and it was a really funny reaction from the robber as well that
Mhm.
he felt. So I think it was really interesting how he was able to. So there is actually ways to follow the path, right?
Mhm.
You have to be quick with it to act quickly.
Yeah, there's also similar stories in the Theragatha, in the verses of the senior monks. Like the one senior monk, Venerable Adimutto, he also gets sort of stopped by robbers, and they sort of start to sort of harass him. But then they notice there's something different about this monk, because the other victims, they're just sort of lamenting and sort of are scared, and this person is sort of completely calm. And so then they ask him, everyone else is sort of scared and sort of lamenting, why are you still so calm? And so then he basically explains what is how he practiced, and they're actually impressed by it. But also Ajahn Sucitto, then he was on India pilgrimage in the maybe 90s or something like that, and he also got threatened by someone with a weapon, and he just sort of more or less bowed down to him and sort of was ready to die, and the person was just sort of shaking and sort of paralyzed and basically couldn't kill him, and but sometimes also some people, let's say, even if you're completely non-violent and actually even, let's say, you have realized awakening, then still obviously you might get killed by hostilities. So it's not a guarantee that this will always work. So I don't want to give a promise in the sense that this will always lead to, let's say, if you're completely non-violent, then others will become completely non-violent as well. I think that wouldn't be correct. But at least in a way, the main thing is to, as I said, the Buddha says that the loss of wealth or relatives or one's own life is actually relatively little compared to losing one's virtue. So from that perspective, that's the most important thing. If it's like in this sort of extreme situation, let's say you're in a country where there's a war and you can't escape or things like that, then that would be the most important thing. Also interesting, the Buddha never sort of tries to, let's say with King Ajatasattu, for example, he probably he sees that King Ajatasattu is not responsive enough to actually stop waging wars. So he, let's say once even King Ajatasattu sends a minister to the Buddha, and he tells the minister he should ask the Buddha, he plans to attack the Vachi Confederation, the country north to him, and the minister should report what the Buddha says. So he's waiting for some auspicious sign that his military campaign will succeed, probably, and asking the Buddha for some hints how it could be successful or something like that, maybe even. And then so the Buddha actually, he just says, he says that these Vachis have 7 qualities, and as long as they are united like this, they can expect only prosperity and not decline. And so he doesn't even sort of criticize him for waging a war or something like that, because probably he notices he's just too obsessed by it. At least it would be my understanding. If he would have seen some option to convince him of something else, I think he would have probably taught him. And I mean, he taught in many discourses, obviously, to abstain from killing living beings. And then, let's say, if this king still continues with it, then obviously he seems not to listen to it. So there's also limited, let's say, also for the Buddha, it seems it was actually limited, let's say, depending on how strong this ambition of a king was, that actually in the case of King Ajatasattu, he was actually not able to convince him to, let's say, not start these military campaigns. Okay, then wish you all the best for developing peacefulness, and see you the next time.